March 18th, 1925. Southern Missouri, 1:01 p.m. It is a Tuesday. Children are inside their schoolhouses, bent over arithmetic. Miners are descending into the earth with their headlamps and their lunch pails. Farm wives are pulling bread from ovens. The smell of warm dough drifts through kitchen windows. Dogs sleep on porches. The radio crackles with nothing important. The sky's the color of a bruise, not the dramatic black of Hollywood storm. Something quieter, more deliberate. A yellow-green that old farmers call tornado weather, though most people that day do not yet have a word for what is coming. The air has gone thick. It hums. Birds stopped singing 40 minutes ago, and nobody thought to ask why. In the town of Ellington, Missouri, a woman named Clara hangs laundry on a line. She notices the stillness. She looks up. She sees, to the southwest, a wall of darkness that seems to eat the horizon. She stands there with a wet shirt in her hands. She doesn't move. In the next 3.5 hours, this single storm will travel 219 miles through Missouri, 147 miles through Illinois, and 93 miles through Indiana, killing 747 people, injuring over 2,000, and erasing entire towns from the map. Clara drops the shirt. She runs. This was not a forgotten corner of America. The towns in the storm's path, Annapolis, Gorham, Murfreesboro, DeSoto, West Frankfort, Griffin, were alive with commerce, with ambition, with the simple confidence of communities that had survived droughts and floods and the cruelty of the First World War. They believed, as people often do, that they were owed a future. Murfreesboro, Illinois was the largest city in Jackson County, and it had a hospital, a hotel, a bustling rail depot, banks, churches, and over 11,000 residents. Its streets were paved. Its storefronts were painted. On any given afternoon, you could hear the hiss of a steam engine, the clatter of a blacksmith, the laughter of schoolchildren released at 3 o'clock. It was a city that smelled of coal smoke and ambition. DeSoto, Illinois was a coal mining town. Hard men, hard work, tight families. The kind of community where everyone knew who had died in the last mine accident. And everyone still went back down anyway, because that was what you did. The children of DeSoto went to a school that their parents had built with donated labor, brick by brick on a hill just east of the main road. They were not victims yet. They were neighbors, workers, parents. They had grocery lists. They had arguments to finish over supper. They had plans. Griffin, Indiana was so small it barely appeared on maps. A farming hamlet of perhaps 200 souls, surrounded by flat fields newly thawed from winter. There was a general store, a Methodist church, and a school. Nothing about it suggested catastrophe. Nothing about it suggested survival. These were the places the storm chose, and it chose them with absolute indifference. Here's the thing about the tri-state tornado that history cannot forgive. It was not entirely a surprise. The United States Weather Bureau had, by 1925, understood the basic mechanics of severe storms for decades. Meteorologists knew that warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico, colliding with cold Arctic air over the flat American interior, created conditions ripe for violent weather. Yet the geography of southern Missouri and Illinois, flat, open, hemmed by river valleys, was practically a laboratory for atmospheric violence. But there was a policy, a deliberate, written, official policy of the Weather Bureau that forbade its forecasters from using the word tornado in public forecasts. The reasoning, documented in internal memos, was that such warnings would cause mass panic, that the public could not be trusted to respond rationally to the word. Better, the Bureau decided to say nothing clearly than to say something frightening. The storm that killed 747 Americans moved through a landscape where no one had been told to run, hide, or even look up. On the morning of March 18th, 1925, a Weather Bureau forecast for the region warned of severe local storms. That was it. Severe local storm. The kind of phrase that a farmer reads in the newspaper and then goes out and plows his field anyway. A scientist named John Finley had, in the 1880s, developed the first tornado warning system in American history, and it had been shut down by the Weather Bureau because officials deemed his predictions alarmist. 40 years later, his successors were still forbidden from uttering the word he had dedicated his career to studying. The tornado was already forming. The warning never came. Ellington, Missouri, 12:55 p.m. The tornado touched down near Ellington, Missouri at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It did not announce itself with the roar that survivors always describe. Not yet. In those first minutes, it was quieter. Witnesses who saw it from a distance described it as looking like a dark cloud dragging along the ground. Some thought it was a dust storm. Some thought it was smoke from a fire. It was neither. It was a column of rotating air nearly a mile wide, with wind speeds that would later be estimated at over 300 miles per hour. It had formed from a supercell thunderstorm that had been developing since morning, fed by an extraordinary clash of air masses. The cold front was sharp and fast-moving. The warm surface air was dense with moisture from unseasonable spring warmth. The conditions were, in the language of meteorology, textbook. What made this tornado different? What would make it the deadliest in recorded American history, was its consistency. Most tornadoes are intermittent. They touch down, lift, touch down again, dissipate after minutes or at most an hour. The tri-state tornado did not lift. For 3.5 hours, it stayed on the ground, traveling in a nearly straight northeast line, as if it had somewhere to be. It was not a natural disaster with the decency to be brief. It was patient, methodical, relentless. It moved at an average speed of 62 miles per hour, faster than most people could drive even on today's highways, and faster than any horse, any wagon, any early automobile. There was no technology in 1925 that could have outrun it. There was no telephone network dense enough to warn the next town in time. The monster had been born, and it was heading northeast. Murfreesboro, Illinois, 2:10 p.m., 40 miles ahead of the tornado, life continued with extraordinary, heartbreaking normality. At Longfellow School in Murfreesboro, a teacher named Miss Edith Davis was leading her second-grade class through a geography lesson. The children were learning the names of rivers. Someone in the back row was passing a note. 2 girls at the window had noticed that the sky looked strange, greenish, heavy, but Miss Davis called them back to attention. Geography first. Weather could wait. At the DeSoto mine, the day shift was finishing. Men climbed up into the early afternoon light, faces blackened with coal dust, nodding to the incoming shift. Some of them walked home. Some stopped at the tavern on the corner. Some picked up children from school. Normal things, Tuesday things. In Griffin, Indiana, a farmer named Walter Sims was repairing a fence along the eastern edge of his property. He noticed the sky. He had grown up in tornado country. He had seen bad weather before. And the sky, he would later say, if he survived to say anything, looked like the inside of a bruise. He thought about going inside. He decided to finish the fence post first. The cruelest thing about the tri-state tornado is that its victims had minutes of warning at best. Most had none at all. In Murfreesboro, a dog began howling from behind a picket fence on Jefferson Street. A woman across the road looked up from sweeping her porch. She listened. She heard from the southwest something she could not quite identify. A sound like 100 freight trains arriving at once. She had about 45 seconds. The first sign was always the pressure. Before any house shook, before any window broke, before the roar became undeniable, the atmospheric pressure dropped so violently that people experienced it physically. Eardrums popping, and a dizzying sensation of the world going hollow. Cattle in fields became agitated and ran in circles. Horses reared. Dogs disappeared under porches. Then came the debris. Not the debris of destruction, not yet, but small things, strange things. Straw from distant barns lifted and carried ahead of the funnel, arriving as impossible messengers. Wisps of hay dropping from a clear patch of sky, followed by silence, then by the smell. Everyone who survived the tri-state tornado described the smell. A dense, electrical, earthy odor like fresh-turned soil, mixed with something burning, something that wasn't quite ozone and wasn't quite sulfur, but was entirely unmistakable once you had experienced it. In Gorham, Illinois, but the storm arrived so fast and so quietly that several residents initially thought an explosion had occurred at a nearby industrial facility. The darkening was sudden, daylight to near darkness in under a minute, as the mile-wide funnel blocked the sun. Children playing outside froze. Teachers ran to schoolhouse doors. A man on a bicycle looked up and simply stopped pedaling. There was no time for the slow creep of dread that we associate with impending disaster. There was light, and then there was the storm. In Murfreesboro, a telegraph operator named Harold Baber sent a desperate, fragmentary message to the state capitol. Terrible storm approaching from southwest. Looks like before the line went dead, before the building containing the telegraph office ceased to exist. The air itself was beginning to come apart. The tornado destroyed communication before it destroyed anything else. Telegraph lines, like the only rapid long-distance communication of 1925, were among the first casualties of the storm's approach. The swirling debris field, which extended miles ahead of the funnel itself, snapped wooden poles like matchsticks and tangled copper wire into useless sculpture. By the time the funnel arrived over a town, that town was already silent to the outside world. Roads flooded and became impassable, not from rain but from debris. Timbers, roof sections, overturned automobiles, felled trees. Rail lines were torn from their beds and bent into improbable curves. The few automobiles that existed in rural Illinois in 1925 were no match for a tornado moving at 62 miles per hour. You could not drive away from this storm. You could not telephone for help. You could not send a messenger. The moment the funnel passed over your horizon, you were alone. In DeSoto, the school building, that brick structure built with community labor and community pride, had no basement. The children inside were on the second floor when the roof came off. There was nowhere to go. There was no protocol. There was no drill. The teacher held as many children as she could reach and pressed them against the interior walls, and the wind took the rest. 25 children died in that school. It remains one of the deadliest single-building collapses in tornado history. Survivors in neighboring towns would not learn what had happened for hours, sometimes days. A man who tried to drive from Carbondale to DeSoto to find his sister found the roads blocked by wreckage for 8 miles. He abandoned his car and walked through the debris field in the dark. He found her. Most people did not find who they were looking for. Murfreesboro, Illinois, 2:26 p.m. The funnel hit Murfreesboro at approximately 2:26 in the afternoon, and it hit it fully. Not a glancing blow, not a near miss, but a direct, sustained, mile-wide assault that lasted 3 minutes and felt, to those inside it, like the end of everything. Brick walls, solid, fire-hardened walls of commercial buildings that had stood for 40 years, buckled inward and then outward, becoming projectiles. Timber-framed houses did not collapse so much as disintegrate. Their boards and joists stripped away and hurled at velocities that could drive a 2x4 through a tree trunk. Windows did not merely break. They turned into horizontal showers of glass that scoured exposed skin from bone. The school on Logan Street lost its roof in the first seconds. The walls followed. Children who were found alive were discovered in the rubble, some of them buried under debris, calling out in voices that rescuers would later describe as the most terrible sound they had ever heard. Small voices from underground, from impossible places saying, "Mother," saying, "Help," saying, "I'm here." A man named Jacob Robertson had taken shelter under his kitchen table when the house around him evaporated. He found himself lying in the open air surrounded by destruction, with his table and nothing else still intact above him, and his wife had been standing at the kitchen sink. The sink was gone. His wife was gone. He crawled from under the table and called her name into a landscape that no longer contained anything recognizable from his previous life. The tornado did not destroy Murfreesboro the way fire destroys gradually with time to flee. It destroyed it the way a fist destroys a sandcastle. 238 people died in Murfreesboro that afternoon. It was the highest death toll of any single city in the storm's path, and the highest single-city tornado death toll in American history, a record that still stands a century later. And the tornado was not finished. It had barely begun. West Frankfort to Griffin, 3 to 4:30 p.m. By the time the tri-state tornado reached its full maturity over the flat farmlands of southeastern Illinois and southwestern Indiana, it had become something that exceeded the vocabulary of meteorology in 1925. It was not a funnel in the classic sense, it was a churning mass of destruction nearly a mile in width, darker than night at its core, roaring with a sound that survivors consistently described as louder than anything they had previously encountered in their lives. One man compared it to standing inside a waterfall made of iron. The storm consumed entire farms in seconds. Barns vanished. Silos that weighed hundreds of tons were relocated. Livestock were found a mile from where they had been standing. Automobiles were deposited in fields, upright with no marks indicating how they had arrived. A safe from a bank in Gorham was found 12 miles away, intact, locked, undamaged, the only survivor of the building that had contained it. Trees were not merely uprooted. They were stripped. Bark, branches, leaves all scoured away until only white polished trunks remained, standing in what survivors described as ghost forests. Hundreds of pale poles in the ground, all pointing at the same angle like a forest of crosses stripped of their crossbeams. The town of Griffin, Indiana, population 200, essentially ceased to exist. Of its few dozen structures, the storm left almost none standing. The school, the church, the general store, the farmhouses, gone. The death rate among Griffin's residents was proportionally among the highest of any community hit that day. Nearly 1 in 4 of the town's people were killed. In Griffin, the tornado did not visit. It erased. When rescuers arrived the next morning, they had difficulty determining where exactly the town had been. In Indiana, as the tornado finally began to weaken after more than 3 hours on the ground, witnesses reported that the funnel seemed to narrow, to lift slightly, to lose its coherence. The roar, which survivors claimed could be heard from 20 miles away, began to fade. The debris cloud thinned. The sky slowly, catastrophically slowly, began to lighten again. The tornado dissipated at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, near the town of Princeton, Indiana. It had been on the ground for 3.5 hours. It had traveled 219 miles through Missouri, 147 miles through Illinois, and 93 miles through Indiana. It had struck 7 counties, killed 747 people, injured 2,027 more, and destroyed over 15,000 homes. Then it was simply gone. The sky closed over it like water closing over a stone. Our statistics are what we reach for when grief becomes too large to hold. 747 dead, 2,027 injured, 15,000 homes. But within those numbers are individual stories of a specificity and tenderness that the aggregate cannot capture. Elsa Schaefer was a schoolteacher in Annapolis, Missouri. When the tornado warning, what little warning existed, reached her classroom, she made a decision that would be remembered for generations. She herded her students into the interior hallway, away from the windows, and stood in the doorframe with her arms spread, physically blocking the way back toward the glass. The building was heavily damaged. Every student in Elsa Schaefer's class survived. Elsa Schaefer did not. Yet a coal miner named Thomas Kessler had been assigned to the day shift at the Murfreesboro mine, but had traded shifts with a colleague that morning because his daughter had a school performance he did not want to miss. His colleague died in the mine when the tornado collapsed the surface structures and cut off ventilation. Thomas Kessler survived, found his daughter alive under a collapsed wall of their home, and carried her to the emergency hospital set up in the least damaged church building still standing. He never spoke publicly about what he had traded, or with whom. In every community the storm touched, there were these calculus problems of survival. The small decisions, the random timings, the split-second choices that sorted the living from the dead with no logic, no fairness, and no mercy. A 14-year-old boy named Raymond Webb survived the destruction of his family's farmhouse by sheltering in a root cellar. He emerged to find that his parents, his 2 younger sisters, and his grandmother had not made it to the cellar in time. He was found the next morning sitting on a piece of foundation in the rain, unable to speak. He would not speak for 3 days. Raymond Webb lived to be 89 years old. He never in 75 years discussed March 18th, 1925. March 19th, 1925. Dawn. The morning of March 19th arrived cold and gray over the wreckage of southern Illinois. There was no dramatic sunrise, no golden light to soften the scene, just a pale, neutral dawn that illuminated, slowly and without mercy, the scale of what had been done. Murfreesboro looked, according to a reporter from the street, a Louis Post dispatch who arrived that morning, as if a giant hand had reached down from the sky and simply scrambled everything. Streets that he had photographs of from the previous year, lined with 2-story brick buildings, churches with steeples, a hotel with a covered entrance, were now fields of rubble in which the occasional standing wall rose like a tombstone from a collapsed civilization. The smell was brick dust, coal smoke from small fires still burning in ruins, and something else, something biological that the reporter did not describe in print. In DeSoto, the surviving parents had spent the night searching through the rubble of the school. Some of them were still there at dawn, pulling boards away by hand, calling names. The rescue workers who arrived from Carbondale and Springfield found these parents and did not know what to say to them. So they said nothing and started pulling boards themselves. The silence of that morning was the loudest thing anyone who experienced it could remember. Towns that had been full of machinery and commerce and human noise were perfectly, horrifyingly quiet. Livestock wandered through the debris fields. Unhurt and bewildered, a cow was found standing in the middle of what had been the First Methodist Church of West Frankfort, in the space where the altar had been, chewing slowly. Some survivors found this darkly funny. Laughter that morning was not inappropriate. It was necessary. The tornado killed 747 people immediately, or close enough to immediately that the distinction barely matters. And what followed killed others more slowly, and threatened to kill more still. In 1925, there was no federal emergency management agency. There was no national disaster relief infrastructure. What response existed was improvised and chaotic. The Red Cross mobilized within hours, but southern Illinois and southwestern Indiana were not easily accessible. Roads were blocked. Rail lines were severed. The towns that needed the most help were the hardest to reach. Medical care was overwhelmed within the first hour. The hospital in Murfreesboro, itself damaged, received more injured patients than it had ever treated in a year, within the first 90 minutes after the storm. Doctors operated by lantern light in damaged buildings. Nurses worked through the night without sleep. The supply of morphine ran out before midnight. Local physicians sent emergency telegrams to St. Louis, to Chicago, to Springfield, requesting supplies that would take days to arrive. Water contamination became a secondary crisis. The tornado had destroyed water mains, septic systems, and the careful infrastructure of sanitation that stood between modern communities and cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. Health officials ordered the boiling of all water. In communities with no fuel, no stoves, and no intact buildings, this order was easier to issue than to follow. Disaster, the survivors of 1925 learned, is not an event. It is a condition. It begins before the storm arrives and continues long after the sky clears. In DeSoto, a temporary morgue was established in the least damaged church. The men who worked there, volunteers mostly, miners and farmers who had never seen anything like this, worked in silence, carefully, with a tenderness toward the dead that none of them could have predicted in themselves before that day. The tri-state tornado did not simply end. It echoed. The rebuilding of Murfreesboro, DeSoto, and the other affected communities took years and was never quite complete. Some families never returned, some blocks were never rebuilt, some empty lots in those towns remained empty for decades as a kind of unconscious memorial. But the disaster also produced responses that would, over time, reshape how America prepares for and responds to severe weather. The Weather Bureau's policy against using the word tornado in public forecasts came under withering criticism following the 1925 disaster. Now, the policy was not immediately reversed. Bureaucracies rarely surrender their absurdities quickly, but the public pressure and the congressional attention prompted by 747 deaths and the obvious failure of the warning system accelerated a decades-long reform. By the 1950s, the first formal tornado warning systems were being developed. By the 1970s, the Doppler radar network that underpins modern storm warnings was beginning to take shape. The disaster also prompted the first serious federal legislation regarding disaster relief, beginning a process that would lead, eventually, to the creation of the Federal Emergency Management Agency a half-century later. The American Red Cross, which responded to the 1925 tornado with improvised heroism, used the lessons of the response to professionalize and systematize its disaster relief operations in the years that followed. The 747 people who died on March 18, 1925, did not die for nothing. They died before a system that might have saved them existed. And their deaths, in part, are why that system was built. In DeSoto, the new school built to replace the one the tornado destroyed was constructed with a basement. It was the first school in Jackson County with a basement specifically designed as a tornado shelter. It was used as such without incident for the next 80 years. A century has passed since the sky over southern Missouri turned yellow-green on a Tuesday afternoon in March. We have, in that century, learned to warn each other. We have Doppler radar and weather satellites and smartphone alerts that scream into our pockets with 90 seconds of notice before a tornado arrives. We have underground shelters and evacuation protocols and FEMA and the National Weather Service and 1,000 meteorologists who are permitted, encouraged even, to say the word tornado as loudly and as often as necessary. We have all of this because 747 people died without any of it. But technology is not wisdom. Warning systems require people who heed them. Evacuation plans require people who follow them. The lesson of the tri-state tornado is not merely that we need better instruments. It is that we need the humility to acknowledge what we do not control, and the courage to act on what we know even when acting is expensive, inconvenient, and frightening. The Weather Bureau officials who banned the word tornado were not villains. They were bureaucrats making a bad decision for what they believed were good reasons. They thought they were protecting people from panic. They were instead protecting themselves from difficulty. The storm that killed 747 Americans in 1925 still has something to say to us. It says, "The truth, however frightening, is always less dangerous than the comfortable silence." The sky does not negotiate. It does not accept excuses. It does not read the memos we write to ourselves explaining why we chose not to look up.